Welcome back to this series of videos about the democratic social contract. So today we will get to the heart of the whole reason why I'm doing these videos. Remember what I said in the introduction. My motivation, the reason why I'm doing this, is because I see so many people out there who no longer believe in democracy. And I think the reason why they have lost faith is not because democracy doesn't work. It's not that it doesn't deliver social progress or makes us richer. Actually, check your facts, because it does. No, I think the whole reason, the root cause, is simply that they don't understand the democratic system. They don't know when they should cry wolf, or instead when, sure, they disagree with the politicians, but actually those politicians are merely performing a legitimate exercise of democratic power. And I think this whole misunderstanding leads to a lot of frustration and anger. And from that point of frustration and anger, a lot of people slide into a point of cynicism when they are like, you know what, the whole system is rotten, so let it rot. But still, the country needs fixing. And you will always find opportunistic people who will be willing to channel your frustrations, your anger, and your cynicism in order to accumulate power. So you will find opportunistic people who will tell you, vote for me and I will fix the country. And of course, as soon as those newly elected people, as soon as they meet checks and balances to their power, they will tell you, those checks and balances are just part of that rotten system. So let me tear them apart. Let me accumulate power so that I can fix the country. Fix. So today we will talk about a very basic concept. It's simply put that democracy equals civil non-violence. Remember what we said when we talked about the very first condition of the social contract. You have to give up all your jungle rights in order to become a citizen. Among those jungle rights, you have the right to kill, the right to rape, but there is also the jungle right to use force in order to impose your will. So in a democracy, citizens are not allowed to use violence or threat of violence in order to impose their own individual will to the others. And whether these others is fellow citizens or parliament itself. Remember what we said. In a democracy, parliament or constitutional referendums are the only legitimate way to decide on laws. When we discussed about the social contract of modern democracies, I explained that when the social body assembled, it delegated sovereignty to parliament. So who decides on the laws? Who decides on the will of that social body, how it moves, what is the head of the social body? It's parliament. But in order to ensure that parliament would be sufficiently accountable towards the citizens, the social body constrained the powers of parliament by setting up checks and balances and fundamental rights that not even parliament can infringe. And as we discussed, referendums allowed by the form of governance of the constitution, those referendums, they are the only instance where actually the social body is sovereign rather than parliament. For all the other cases, parliament is sovereign. So parliament and constitutional referendums are the only way to decide on the will of the social body. But if there is no law enforcement, there is no law. So even though citizens are not allowed to use violence in order to impose their own individual will, the state has the legitimacy to use violence in order to enforce the law, and only the law. You probably know this concept from the philosopher Max Weber, who says that the state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And what is the amount of force that the state, through the police, has the legitimacy to use against citizens? Well, it's only the strictly necessary amount of force required to get you in compliance with the rule of law. It's absolutely not meant as a mean of repression, of punishment. No matter how much you dislike a person, you cannot sponsor that this person gets beat up by the police. Remember what we just said. In order to protect citizens from abuse by the sovereign, by parliament, and by law enforcement, by the executive branch, fundamental freedoms were enshrined in the Constitution. And among those fundamental freedoms, you have protection against physical abuse by the state. But let me go back to this question of lawmaking. In France, you have this myth, this widely spread belief that rioting and blockades are the fourth branch of democratic power. So you know the three actual branches of democratic power, which are the judiciary, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And in France, you have this widely spread misconception that rioting and blockades are part of the checks and balances within the French democracy. This misconception has no constitutional backing. It's not the case in France, it's not the case in any democracy. Although freedom of demonstration has not been directly enshrined in the French constitution, jurisprudence has established it as an essential right because it has established it as an emanation of freedom of speech. And as you know, virtually unbound freedom of speech has been enshrined in all democratic constitutions in order to ensure sufficient accountability of all the branches of government towards the citizens. So when you are exerting your freedom of demonstration, keep in mind that it is an emanation of your freedom of speech. It is not a right of rioting and blockading. It is not a mean to introduce balance of power between your group of determined people and the other branches of democratic power. It is not the fourth branch of democratic power. One right that actually has been enshrined in constitutions in order to introduce a healthy dose of balance of power is the right to strike. And you see in my wording, I'm saying a well-regulated right to strike. Because you will check yourself in the French constitution and the other constitutions where this right has been enshrined, you will see that it has not been enshrined as an unbound right. It's not like the freedom of speech, which has been enshrined pretty much unbound. Here, constitutions usually leave leeway to Parliament in order to regulate that right. Back to the subject, what I wanted to say is that this right has been enshrined in order to introduce a healthy dose of balance of powers within society, between employees and employers. It's not meant as a check, a balance of power of the other branches of democratic power. On top of having been introduced to introduce a healthy dose of balance of power between employees and employers, the right to strike is also considered as an emanation of freedom of speech. So again, when you are enjoying the right to strike, you are enjoying your freedom of speech as well as a healthy dose of balance between you as an employee and your employers. But the right to strike doesn't constitute the fourth branch of government. Here we are talking about the democratic principles that lay the legal grounds for the legitimate use of force by the state and the boundaries of your rights, more specifically that you can't use force to impose your will, not even to Parliament. But if you no longer believe in the social contract of your country, it is understandable that you may feel emboldened to break the law and use force to impose your will. This is even more so if pollsters say that the majority of your fellow citizens agree with you. But polls are not votes. Mob rule is not democracy. Majoritarian rule is not democracy. If you disagree with this, you need to watch my previous episodes all over again, because by now you should have understood that democracy is about guaranteeing each other fundamental freedoms and protection. Parliamentary rule is ruled by Parliament. Parliament's power are checked and balanced according to the Constitution, and Parliament is accountable to the people through elections and freedom of expression, freedom of press, and so on. But parliamentary democracy is not rule of the majority. Of course, when Parliament votes for unpopular laws, this puts under strain the adherence of citizens towards the social contract and its obligation of non-violence. But even if you no longer believe in the social contract of your country, before engaging in violence to impose your particular will, you are still under the moral obligation to consider the rights of your fellow citizens, and not just those who agree with you. And you are still under the moral obligation to make sure that you have exhausted all the non-violent options. Rioting is never legitimate to oppose non-irreversible changes unless they infringe on your fundamental rights. Indeed, as your fundamental rights are not infringed, you still have the time to use your freedom of expression, freedom of association, and all your fundamental rights related to political life in order to create a political consensus to reverse that change. Democracy requires patience, but the record shows it. Democracy does deliver social progress. So when is rioting legitimate? Well, according to the Constitution, it never is. But according to the democratic principles that we have discussed, rioting is understandable if your fundamental rights are not respected, or if the checks and balances of the Constitution are in danger. In other words, rioting is understandable when the spirit of the social contract is not respected or in danger. I said understandable, not legitimate. Why? Because when you use violence to impose your will, you are always operating outside of the terms of the social contract that require you to give up on violence. So the social contract cannot provide legitimacy to your rioting. I said understandable, not advised, because you have to be strategic. If you engage in rioting, you are most likely to lose the support of regular citizens. And if the majority of citizens had not rallied to your cause at the first place, you are sure to fail to convince them by using rioting. This is no surprise that one of the greatest figures for the progress of civil rights for minorities is Martin Luther King Jr., thanks to his peaceful and compassion-inducing movement. I see the French tradition of rioting and blockades as a cautionary tale. When you ask rioters why they riot, they will often tell you this: because it works, and because this is the only thing that works. And indeed, the government often backs down or delivers concessions. So even though the power of the streets, I mean riots and blockades, even though this power is not a legitimate branch of democratic power, it does weigh in the balance of power against the legitimate democratic power, especially the legislative and executive branches. It is also true that this power of the streets is only possible in a democracy. Of course, in a dictatorship, such riots and blockade would ultimately get crushed by the army. And I am not denying that this power of the streets does deliver some social progress. This French tradition of rioting and blockading may be one of the reasons why France sits among the least unequal developed countries. If you look at this graph, you can see that before taxes and transfers, French income is roughly as unequal as the other developed countries, such as the US or Britain. But you can see that taxes and transfers do a great stride to reduce the income inequality between citizens. So then, why do I see it as a problem? Well, I see this power struggle between rioters and blockaders and the legitimate branches of democratic power as a sugar rush. It does deliver results, but those results are not long-lasting, and it is unhealthy. It is unhealthy for the social contract because it is in breach with the principle of civil non-violence. In a democracy, conflicts should take place within parliaments, not within the streets. But it is also unhealthy for the social contract because it provides an excuse for the politicians in power to confiscate some freedoms. Indeed, they use the fact that they sit in a legitimate position to use force against those rioters to confiscate some freedoms. Rights groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have alerted about the fact that peaceful protesters are getting their freedom of demonstration curtailed. Indeed, those peaceful protesters are getting caught up in crowd control and the fight against rioters. And rioters also have been abused. Rioters still have rights, and they are still protected by the Constitution against excessive use of force by the state. But with the recurring cycle of riots, blockades, and police violence, the public becomes desensitized, and the freedom of demonstration gets curtailed through the excuse of fighting rioters. This sugar rush is unhealthy. Democracy requires patience. The only legitimate and healthy way to obtain the change that you want in society is to win elections. You may feel that you don't have much of a choice between one party or another, but the main job of politicians is to win elections. Politically engaged citizens who manage to steer the public conversation towards their favorite subjects have a great influence in politics. Indeed, as those engaged citizens manage to bring their favorite subject at the limelight of public debate, their subjects get ultimately picked up by politicians, whether it is in favor or against, and the fate of those favored subjects will be determined by elections. For instance, you can look at the example of same-sex marriage, which in France was legalized thanks to a vote in parliament. Or you can also take the example of the current conversation about transgenders' rights. Whether or not you support those changes, you still have to acknowledge that those who do have efficiently used their freedom of expression, freedom of press, and other political freedoms in order to bring this subject in the limelight of political debate. And ultimately, they managed to get the politicians who supported their cause to win elections. Regardless where you stand on those issues, this is a legitimate way to deliver change in a democracy. Don't let the social contract of your country become diabetic. Do not partake in the sugar rush of violence.